So I'm Tina Nunez with APS EdTech, and this is one of our EdTech Bytes sessions. This is a short session to show you an idea about how to backwards plan your Google Forms to get the type of data that you want at the end. So the first thing we want to think about with Google Forms is how you want to use that final data. Are you going to use those response graphs that are built within the forms themselves? Or are you going to more so use the data that you have on the spreadsheet that's created from the forms? So I'm going to show you what that looks like really quick. Are you going to want to use this data that you are going to sort and filter and use? Or are you more so wanting to use the type of data that is in graph form? So understanding those components, let's look at the types of responses you get. If you create a Google form and you use a multiple choice question, it creates a pie chart. If you use checkboxes, it creates sort of a sideways bar graph. Linear scales create bars. Grids create multicolored bars. In short answer, you can filter through those responses. So what I'm going to show you is what not to do first. So if you want to go to this bit.ly/formsno, it's going to open up this Google form. I'm going to show myself taking this form since this is a recorded webinar, and I'm going to show you some of these questions that have actually been pulled from forms in our district. But these are actual questions we've seen on classroom, principal, or department forms. What grade level or department do you work for? Who's your instructional leader at your school? I don't know. And then this one is fun. What days of the week would work best for our staff meetings based on the grade you teach? And, you know, there's some options here if I'm in special education or if I'm a parent. What do you think would best describe you out of the different options that would be available for the meetings that are coming in the future at a time that works for you? I don't want to go. So we're going to add that as an option. Would you like to be added? I don't know, maybe. Would you want to be added to the phone list? Heck no. What topics would you like to have covered in future staff meetings? I'm just going to pick all of them because they look kind of long. For our past meetings, how satisfied or dissatisfied have you been? Yes to both. And on a scale of 1 to 5, I rate them as a 3. Here are some charts and graphs that are made from this data. The maybe gives you an entire circular option. If you ask for what is your name, there are so many different ways you can write it. And then this is that graph. I can't even make sense of grades or anything like that. The other thing is with such long descriptions and checkboxes, you cannot see this data very well. And then if you create a question that has an other or extra option on it, it actually adds that to that chart, and that actually adds data to your space. So going to that particular form, I am going to go to that spreadsheet. And what you may not know is that this was a Google branching form that asked the same types of questions branched out in different areas. So for example, if you said, what day of the week would best work for you? Here, I can't sort this data because that same exact question is over here for what type of the day of the week works best for you. Some other things in this sheet is if you want to know the instructional lead, I can't sort or filter this data. Also, when it said, what grade level or department do you work for? I can't get any clear data off of this because some people put 5th grade, some people put 5th or 4th, 425, or put a number. So this is that what we like to call dirty data. I have a lot of notes and a lot of words, but I don't have a lot that I can work with other than maybe this one. So let's talk about some of the common issues you shouldn't do. First of all, you shouldn't have separate sections that have the same data in them. You might want to only have a separate section in a form for something completely different or an optional section you want them to answer. Grid style questions. This one obviously had way too many columns. You actually had to scroll across, and then it was really confusing on how to match them. And you don't need to match all of those things in a grid style. Having really long, vague multiple choice questions with huge descriptions. Google Forms does have the other option, but honestly, I don't feel like that is a great option. I'll show you kind of a workaround for that for good data. Once again, we talked about long responses, especially in a checkbox question, because it puts all of these responses together in one cell. So we'll talk about that. And then on a linear scale, most people will try and pick the middle option, especially if it's a controversial question. So knowing that, if you are on our webinar, go ahead and try this form if you want to check it out. It's bit.ly/forms yes. And that's going to open up this Google form. So I'm going to show me taking this form really quick, and then I'm going to show you how I built it out. The first thing is there's a question for a first name with an example and a last name in 2 different questions. The other thing is we've added some pictures of instructional leaders with multiple choice questions so you can only pick that one specific person. With the grade level, it has a drop down. So all of that data stays the exact same. The days to pick for staff meetings has only one option, which is the best option here in the description. And for this one, we were very specific on a checkbox question for picking 3 times, and we kept those options very short. Here is a multiple choice grid question. It has all of the information here on the side of the questions as opposed to across the top. Google Forms works linearly, so you're going to want to have the bulk of the information that's more going up and down versus left to right. So I'm going to pick some options here. And over here, instead of having an other selection included where I have that data, I'm going to add another question that says, what are some other topics of interest that were not mentioned above? Satisfaction from past meetings. Now we've created a question here that is based off of an even number. So you have to pick either upper or lower quadrants. And then we had an optional suggestion question, which is the one where you can type out an answer and still have that available, but it's an optional question and it does say that you can skip it. And then here is where this form branches out. If I say no, then I'm going to be able to submit this form. But if I say yes, I want to be added to communications, that's the section that I go to and say which communication channel I want to be added to, and then I can submit it. I'm going to now walk you through some of these best practices that are going to be included in our presentation. In this presentation, it's going to have the tips and tricks inside here with the example of the form so you can remember what we talked about, and it's going to go along with the webinar. So the first thing is to have 2 separate questions for a first name and a last name. And to keep your data nice and clean, when I show you the good spreadsheet in a minute, you want to have the question as short as possible and add details in the description. So if you've never done that in a Google form before, this is the editable version. This is a short answer question that says, what is your first name? Now, I did take advantage of capital letters and these text feature boxes here to edit the question. If I go to these 3 dots on this question, you can add a description. The description is for people who take the form, but they don't get exported out into the sheet and with all of your data. I like to have a first name and a last name so that way I can sort by either one of those options. The other thing is consider using some images. So to do that, you are going to want to create a multiple choice question. Once you add an option here in the multiple choice and you hover over that, you have the ability to add an image right here. You can upload or select from your computer, or you can search Google Images, which apparently Chris Pratt has now joined our team. I am very excited for that prospect. Another thing you probably noticed is that there is a drop down. If you want to keep very clean data, consider creating drop downs versus the types of questions with short answers. So in this case, this was what grade level do you teach? It is a drop down question. And when you look at it in the buildable form, it looks like a list. But when I go here to this preview button or I see the live form, drop downs look like this. This is where you can add an other option. So that way someone can put that as an area without typing in a really long different description. And that'll just create one slither that says other on that pie chart. Now let's talk about multiple choice and check box answers. And then I've put these in chronological order and made them as short as possible, especially for checkbox questions. You're going to want those to be very, very short. I use the checkbox data in the form graphs themselves a lot more than I do in the spreadsheet itself. So for example, if I go back to this response form, I can see the instructional leads. I can very quickly see what grade levels people teach And then here's those days that people want a staff meeting. And then here is where you can look at the checkbox responses. And since these are such short responses, this graph allows all of the information to be next to the data. The next thing is grid choices. I said to create the bigger bulk of information going up and down versus across. So what that looks like in the form itself in a multiple choice grid is columns should always have the shorter list and shorter word amounts here. When I use this in my classroom for vocabulary, this is where I would put the words in the columns and I would put descriptions here in the rows. I also like to say pick the top 3 topics or how many you would like here in the description. Once again, by going to these 3 dots and going to description. And in these 3 dots, I can also limit to 1 response per column to make sure that they only select those 3 options. Here's where I was saying instead of adding an other element here, what I like to do is just create a new short answer question so you can keep all that data together in 1 column on your spreadsheet and say what is another topic of interest not mentioned. And in the description, I say, please skip this. Because what happens is when you would acquire these questions that are other or optional, or you don't say that they can skip it, you're going to get responses like, I don't know, I don't have an idea, and then that data isn't really helpful. Linear options to have an even scale helps a little bit more, and adding emojis. If you've never added emojis to a Google form, this is my linear scale. I'm going to do it on a scale of 1 to 4, a nice even number. What you do is you right-click in this space and go to emoji. So right-click emoji, and then you can add those emojis. Once again, I have another question style to ask for options that you can skip, and that is here in my cheat sheet of a presentation. And then the section for optional responses is here at the end. So if you've never created a section, and I have a Google Forms branching webinar I did very recently that's also in part of our EdTech Bytes series, but I'm just going to show you really quick. I'm going to add a new section, which was communication channels, and that's this button right here. And then here are the options for people to fill out if they want to be added to that communication section. Okay, so now that I've created a section, right before that section, you're going to want a multiple choice question. I want the people who say no to submit the form, and if they say yes, only those people are going to have to fill out this section. So what I'm going to do is go to these 3 dots, add a section based on an answer, and if they say yes, I want them to go to that communication section, and if they say no, I want them to submit the form. Now I have a pretty good form that's easy for people to follow, and it's very specific. And then now let's look at this sheet with clean data. So if you want to check it out, it's bit.ly sheet. Yeah, I can very quickly select this little drop down and I can sort the sheet by A to Z by first name. Or if I'm not clear on that, I can sort this now by A to Z last name. I can very quickly filter out information. You just select the entire form responses. You select this little image that looks kind of like a martini glass, but it's a filter right here. And you're going to see these like little upside down triangles right here in the sheet. And it's going to create a new data point for any individual different data point. So this is why it's so important to create responses that are the same throughout your data. So in this case, we very much picked the same specific names of people based on their images. So if I want to go here, I'm going to clear this out and say I only want me as the instructor, and I only want to filter out the classes that I was with that were 4th grade, then that is going to be all that information filtered out. It's still there, but it's filtered. You can't do that in a spreadsheet that's stretched across a lot of spaces, or if someone had typed in the word 4th versus 4 versus 4th. And I went back and I cleared off those filters by rechecking them, or you can just turn this filter off. Now I'm going to go here and I'm going to select this top column and I'm going to go to format and I'm going to wrap the text. What I want you to notice is that these headers are much smaller than in the data that had these giant long descriptions. And that's because the only information that was pulled over was the question, not those descriptions. Now, if I scroll down this way, I made sure to put other very large in the question, so that way I know this is one of those optional questions. If I go here and I sort out the information, all the blanks are going to be on the bottom. I still get people who put NA, no, or skip, and apparently tacos were a big deal. Go over here to this information for that optional section. On this bottom section, I forgot to mention that instead of saying yes or no to be added, what I did is I said, you want to be added to the shared drive, and I made shared drive an option because it's so much easier to go here and filter out the data that says shared drives. And then I know for sure these are all the people who want to be added to shared drive versus just looking at responses that say yes or no, where I can fuse them or mix them up for which areas they want to be added to. So that is just a really quick, brief overview of some ideas for forms, tips, and tricks.